So the Senior Minister of State will be sticking around to further this conversation with an esteemed panel. I'd like to welcome to the stage Moderator Yeong, the Assistant Chief Executive for Data Innovation and Protection at the Infocomm Media Development Authority. Please step up to the stage. We also have Sundaya Devanathan, Country Manager for Singapore for Facebook. Joining them, we have Sherif Elsayed-Ali, Director of AI for Good at Element AI. I think at the end. We have Dr. Ieva Martinkenaite, Vice President of AI and IoT Business Development at Telenor Research, and Professor Xiao Hanhua, Professor of Law and Deputy Director, Institute of Law for the Chinese Academy of Social Services. Please put your hands together. Thank you very much.
Well, good morning, everyone, and well, thanks for taking time off from viewing the exhibition and having your meetings to come to listen to the opening address and participate in this panel. I don't think that I'll need to introduce every single member of the panel, but what I thought I would do is perhaps just jump right straight in, following on this discussion about trust, right? How do we want to build trust in AI, and how do we want to create that opportunity for us to be able to innovate while building up that relationship with our consumers and to build this reinforcing feedback loop where as we are encouraged to innovate, consumers are prepared to use the AI-empowered features, and then together we can make progress. So when we talk about trust in AI, we take an ecosystem view. We need to take a look at what are the building blocks that go into building trusted AI. And as Senior Minister has mentioned, data is one important component. And the second component will be the applications, the algorithms that you build around the data. And of course, ultimately, each of us, we run our businesses, we have relationships with consumers and our customers. As companies, how do we bring all these together, and what's our role in it, right? So what I'll do is perhaps we could organize our discussion around these three topics: trust around data, trust around the applications and algorithms that go into them, and trust around companies. So let's kick off with our first topic, trust in data. And what are the issues and how do we view? We have Professor Cho, right? He will kick off the discussion and give us a view of what's been happening in China and how they view trust in data. And I'll invite the rest of the panelists to respond and add their comments and their different perspective. Professor, please.
Good morning. I'm really glad to have this opportunity to participate in this panel discussion. And I echo the importance of trust for the AI development, especially at a current quite a special moment about the trade dispute. The fundamental issue is also the trust. The AI research and deployment in China has been quite rapid. As a lawyer, I would like to share one story with you about the AI application. Different courts in China have been using the AI technology to help the judicial process. The most famous one is the system developed by the Shanghai Higher Court. Now, because in China, the population, so the caseload is huge. And each judge normally will handle about 200 to 300 cases 1 year. And the average caseload for Beijing's judges is around 350. So the Shanghai People's Court use AI facilitated judgment mechanism. Now, a junior judge, if you have a new case, you just need to input the new case into the system. Then there will be a written verdict come out immediately. And you just need to try to figure out maybe some problems regarding this machine produced verdict. And we call this AI facilitated verdict system. The judge make the final decision, but the AI produce suggestions or even the final verdict. This is the application, I say. In many different areas now, the application has been developed very quickly, but there are also problems. I would share another story by one of my good friends. He's also very famous law professor. One day, my friend and his son, they use two different brands of mobile phone. But his one definitely is better than his son's mobile phone. And they use the phone because the traffic is so heavy. So both of them, they use the phone, try to make a reservation for ride-sharing car. And they got two different price or rate for the same journey. And he found out that is a kind of predatory pricing activity. So when you apply the AI, there are quite a lot of problems like bias, discrimination, which now is quite common in different circumstances of application. So we reached the conclusion that the data is the foundation for the AI application. So China has been promoting the data security, data quality, and the data usage and the data sharing. We use two mechanisms. One is soft law, like the EU, like OECD or G20. They just also adopted the AI principle or guidelines or whatever. So we use the soft law, like standards, like guidelines, and etc. And actually, several days ago, Chinese AI governance expert group just issued principles of AI development, which is very interesting. On the other hand, we also use the hard laws or regulations. As you might have heard, we already promulgated Internet security law. In this law, we laid down the foundation for data protection as well as data sharing. So how can you collect data, whether you need to get the permission or consent from the data subject, or is an opt-in or opt-out mechanism, and how do you handle the data for daily business, and also we also have kind of data localization requirements regarding cross-border flow of data. So that's the basic two mechanisms: soft law versus hard laws and the regulations. And objective is quite simple too. On the one hand, we need to protect the data. On the other hand, we need to stimulate the usage, the free flow of data, which are quite difficult task. Let me stop here.
Yeah. Well, thank you for setting that framework of how important data is, the quality of data, the practices around governance of data, and the use of data. And setting the framework that we actually have you need a mix of both hard law and soft regulations, right, to shape the environment. Perhaps I could invite the rest of the panelists to give their perspective from industry. What's the mix and what's the appropriate balance between hard and soft, and what would you like to see casting your eyes in the future? Perhaps Dr. Ieva, perhaps to start with you.
Thanks a lot for having me, and good morning to everyone. Well, I think first of all, when we want to create trust, it's important to distinguish between at least 3 layers of trust from a business point of view as well. The first, we need to do institutional trust. It's very important. It creates legal certainty, and that's very important for companies as well. Number 2, we need to create organizational trust. There has to be governance principles ingrained in operations of companies, that they actually see value of having ethical AI and responsible AI in putting their codes and products in operation. And last but not the least, it's very important to create trust in education, in user environment, in research, and people that will eventually use these products, and they have to be aware of what is trusted and what is not. So how do you create that kind of ecosystem? Well, at least Telenor has been sitting in this European high-level expert group in Brussels, trying to come up with some kind of propositions or recommendations of what the ethical AI or trustworthy AI should look like. And we said, the group said, like, look, in order to create trustworthy AI, meaning adoption of these technologies in a responsible manner, you have to be aware that there are fundamental principles to start with, as values, if you like, that companies, organizations, people should adhere to. And what are these? That we are all as humans are concerned. Number 1, we are very concerned of how much of autonomy, the human autonomy we have in decisions. Number 2, we are all concerned about safety and security. So that has to be in products, in education, in institutional trust. And then we want fairness and non-discrimination. We don't want discriminatory data. We don't want discriminatory algorithms. We want fairness. And then last principle is explicability. I mean, be transparent and explainable, right? I mean, how do you create these products with AI? How do you explain and communicate to your customers and to your end users? So in a nutshell, we need to, in order to create trusted AI, you need to have governments and regulators, right, creating some institutional governance around it. You need organizations really believing and trusting in that and putting in operation. And then last, you need to create even much more in education, in creating actually that awareness in the society so that they can eventually distinguish and take that not for granted, but whenever you use the product, you know that there's some kind of standards, there's some kind of regulatory frameworks and some kind of organizational frameworks that are ingrained in that. That would be at least my take on that.
Sherif?
Yeah, thank you very much. So yeah, and I think there's maybe a point I wanted to make is that if you look at data, there's two kinds of way that people's personal data goes somewhere and is used. One is when people voluntarily or at least consciously give away data, and the other one is sort of the more let's say it's not unconscious, but it's passive data being given. So and I think so starting with the sort of the more active data given, and this happens whenever we sign up to a service, we use a device or something, and then we have to agree to the terms and conditions. And we know that the problem there is that from that very first interaction, it's almost impossible to, for normal people to read the terms and conditions. And there's some studies kind of looking at, like in the course of one day, if you're using your mobile phone with various apps, you're talking about 3,000 pages of terms and conditions that come with that. And we still taking a very legalistic approach to it, and a very legalistic approach to saying, okay, you need to read all of this, you need to understand a lot of, be comfortable with law to be able to deal with that. And I think that that's still something that we haven't solved, and there are good reasons why we need that, but at the same time, people consent to their data being used in certain ways without really having that very active control. And that's still something that I think we're struggling with still around the world. But at least it's a conscious choice. So at least that's there. The other part is that, if I'm walking down the street and, we've seen it kind of things being trialed in lots of different places, and sort of there are ways that then you can, it could be in a shop, it could be for marketing purposes, for example, but you're walking down a public road, and your body is scanned, your face is scanned to see how you feel about certain things. Would you like to buy something or not? And that's a passive. You never consent to that, and that is, I think, a lot more problematic. And it becomes more of a problem then when it becomes used for purposes that are sometimes not evidence-based. So, there's these ideas around kind of using gait recognition, for example, to see what your intentions are. And this is not even science-based. And so that's, I think, the biggest area of concerns, and that's one I think if we misuse it, then I think that would reduce a lot of trust in technology.
Well, I think if I could just try and draw some of the threads that we've covered so far, right? We know the importance of trust around data, and data can be collected through active participation, as you mentioned, where I can actually know that I'm contributing the data, but sometimes passively, and it becomes relevant, right? This distinction becomes all the more relevant when we talk about trust in the institutions, in the organizations that are making use of this data, that are custodians of this data, and we need to have a right mix of hard and soft regulation to try and set the right balance, the fair amount of responsibility on the organization, and also consumers who are participating by actively contributing data. So, Sandhya, within this framework, what do you think? What's your comments as a social media company around how you're handling data?
So I think just to set the context on how AI is foundational to everything we do at Facebook. We use it to power new experiences for our users. So it could be VR, it could be 360-degree photographs, it could be 3D photos. We use it for better targeting and to make our products itself better. It could be tagging your friends, it could be the ads that you see. And the last bit and the most important bit is about keeping our users safe on our platform. It could be taking down fake profiles, so we use AI across. It's foundational. So we take a really holistic view on AI. We look at three sets. One is we invest a lot in the people who build AI tools for us and the products and platforms for us, so that's a big area of focus. The second one is the data, and I'll come to that in a little bit, really around if the data itself, the data set itself has biases built in it, then how does AI learn from that, and how do we build better products? So there's a lot of investment in the second pillar, which is around data. And the third bit is around the algorithms itself, that drive off that data. So there are three areas, and we really think about each investments in each one of them. Coming to the bit around data itself, let me give you an example. So if you think about social avatars in VR, and you could have a set of faces that look like a bunch of, maybe just one place in California where it's being developed, or it could represent the whole world, and we wanted to represent diverse faces. So a lot of work is put into the art around the kinds of data set in terms of the pictures, but also into people that actually hand label those pictures. So a lot of training around bias, around diversity. So there's that work that we do as well. And that's a simple example of how we think about data and data use in building our AI products. The second bit, and I think this comes down to the three pillars you talked about, it also talks about application of data, is the work that we're doing with IMDA. Which is around startup station. So we have 10 startups that we've picked up. Zikin's a sponsor of this, so it's great to work with IMDA on it. But really what it aims to do is provide a regulatory sandbox so that 10 startups can actually work on a sandbox where they're testing their data live, but in a contained, both a contained space and duration. So we think that there's great things that could potentially come out of it. And the bits that we're really focused on is notice and consent. So do people know how their data is being used? Are they consenting to it real time? Or how do you think about those flows? And artificial intelligence explainability is the other bit that we're focused on. So we think actually that is a fantastic example of how you can collaborate with regulators and actually work on something that could have impact not just for Facebook in terms of how we explain how we use our data, but also many other startups in the region. So that's how we think about it.
Yeah, thanks. I think you introduced a very good and important element into this discussion, the people, right? The people that we have as employees, because we can have soft regulation, hard regulation, we can have frameworks, we can have social norms and values, we can have all the processes in place. But the key to making it work are the people within the company right? Our own employees, our staff, and how we build this consciousness into the way they work and think about and approach these issues. And I think starting with startups is one good example as well, because then you ingrain this into part of the DNA of the startup as it is growing. But for established organizations, what can we do, and how can we approach this? Now, I've gone off script here, right? So I'm just going to throw this question to any one of the panelists who wants to pick this up and just talk about how do we deal with this issue of creating the right culture within our organization that will foster and promote a culture of trust as we do our work.
I can start. Well, also from Telenor's perspective and experience, what we also see, before even going to trust, there's some fundamental data questions that people need to understand and learn in companies. And what we're also learning, putting aside some time for learning new things, like data analytics and data cleaning jobs and software engineering, it's tremendously important. So we have this 40-hour challenge initiative in Telenor, where we give every and each employee aside hours to learn new things, something where we believe the companies will go forward. And what we also see, number two, is role models become so important. Role models that come from the management, role models that come from the people. So showing those, giving aside time, simple as that, to learn new tools, it's becoming tremendously. And then we also see that working cross-functional, have diversity in teams. AI is not about coding or computer science only. It's about bringing a social scientist, a business person into, and a consumer. A customer front, customer first is number one importance, right? So trying to do simple things on the data management is number one, and then role models is powerful.
Yeah, I would like to add my perspective. I have been contacting with Chinese internet companies for many, many years. So I have some observation regarding how to establish this kind of culture. Originally, many companies, they thought the privacy protection or data protection was a cost rather than anything else. So they didn't like data protection that will make things very complicated, especially might hinder your innovation. But after development for certain years, now you can see the change of conception or the change of value. Now more and more companies, they take data protection not as a burden, not as a cost, but rather as a brand. You know, many companies, originally they established the risk prevention team, whatever, as an investment. But now bigger companies, actually they can output the safety mechanism as a product. So you change the way of thinking. And more companies now they provide the security service for other companies. So I think the most important measure to try to create the culture is you need to incentive. You need to establish incentive for the employees to let them to abide by the rules and put the value of data security at the higher level. So I think that might be more important.
Yes, I think you raise a very good point. Good practices around data, right? Trust can actually be a brand. Trust can be part of your product, right? And how do we build that? I think Dr. Ieva mentioned that you need to give space. You need to give space for employees to be able to learn new concepts, pick up new tools, think about how they want to change the way of doing things. Now, perhaps we could build on these two, and I invite other comments. SMS, you have something to add?
Yeah, if I may. I think if we are clear that a mindset shift, a cultural change, a deep sense of personal trust in how to trust AI is necessary, I think there's a few other things that we can think about. One is that this is not something each company or each organization or each institution needs to do on its own. In fact, I think if you're looking for a cultural change or a change in mindset, it is quite counterproductive to try to do this on your own in a very insular manner. This really is about a social change. And so as a result of which we do have to accept that some of these things need a platform for a multitude of organizations to come together. And this needs to affect companies, and this needs to affect voluntary welfare organizations. And what, unfortunately, for some people in the ecosystem, it means that there's a role for the regulator. There is work to be done for PDPC, because otherwise you have an incentive to protect this, and I'm going to make this my competitive edge, my competitive IP. And really, that works in the short term, it works for a small set of aims, but it's not going to shift our culture and our society as a whole. So there may well be a need for some minimal light touch regulation just to sort of get some standards across organizations within a country, let's say. But I think if you zoom out, actually one of the issues is many of the organizations, and this doesn't just apply to large tech companies like Facebook, actually even voluntary welfare organizations or small startups are fully plugged into what's happening around the world. And it's very hard to say, look, here's a cultural shift or a social shift around trust in AI that we're trying to develop here in Singapore, when actually people are logging on and they're seeing what people are talking about in San Francisco or in Europe or in China. And so there is an opportunity then to plug into that conversation, and it needs to be a multilateral, multi-stakeholder discussion. But I don't think that precludes the idea that you can have a local variant of that. I mean, in truth, not every economy, not every country, not every city, not every organization is at that same level of technological capability, and you need some variance. And I just wanted to point out one example, which is how we have this whole issue of data privacy. And you've got GDPR for Europe, 28 economies, and you've got the APEC cross-border privacy rules for processors, and which we are also trying to adhere to. And now you have the ASEAN data sharing framework. And then here in Singapore, you have your trusted data protection, your data protection trust mark. A skeptic or a cynic could look and say, look, we are fragmenting the whole data sharing space, and this is the wrong way to do it. And if the person saying that is in one of these organizations, the correct answer is, do it my way, and that's the correct way. But the reality is that actually all of these frameworks are being made to interoperate. And I think that's the correct way to think about it. The spread of economies that are covered by APEC and the issues around APEC, actually, it's not quite the same as the EU. And what's happening in the EU ain't the same as what's happening in ASEAN. And maybe there are things within Singapore that we need to have a little bit of space to develop at our own pace. So I think we need space for everybody to localize that shift at their own pace, have a view of what the global picture is and what the direction we need to go through, and processes so that we can do this in a multilateral, open, rules-based way through dialogue. Things like this, at a local level, get VWOs and organizations involved. At a national level, think about the role of a regulator to bring everybody together. And at a multinational level, think about what are the fora that we need, like our expert high-level group that we have participated in, like forums like ASEAN, APEC, and the GDPR. I don't think, I'm not a cynic, I'm an optimist. I think the fact that there are so many people trying to tackle this is a good thing. We just have to make sure that everybody can interoperate and do this together, and everybody can move at their same pace in the same direction. Then I think we'll be off to a good start.
Well, thanks for providing that other perspective as well. So we need space for employees, we need space for companies, right, that are working in this area so that we can find a variance of what works. And then we talk a bit also about creating those incentives, right, and recognition of companies who are having these kind of good practices. Now, the other three panelists we have here operates around the world. You've got operations that spread around the globe. What's your perspective and what's your response to what Senior Minister has just said about the diversity, the space within the diversity for us to be able to create, but also a certain need for us, a certain harmonized or universal standard so that it is easy for not just big companies but startups who are going out into the world. What's your comments and what do you think about that?
Minister Janil, if we do achieve the utopia of interoperability, it would be awesome. That would be, that would be a great outcome. But as Facebook, I think the thing that you talked about, which is just sharing research, sharing the work that's happening itself, will, I think, progress the industry and the ecosystem together, and that's one thing that we're quite strongly focused on. So we have two groups in AI on Facebook. One is an internal Facebook AI group, which looks at taking our standards and applying it across all our products and platforms. What we've also set up is a group called FAIR, which is Facebook AI Research. And here what we do is open source, we do collaborative research papers, because we really think the same way that you do, Minister Janil, which is really around advancing research for the industry versus just for Facebook alone. And some of the things that have come out of that are now being used across, like PyTorch, CafeB, Fast Text, which translates text into multiple languages. Those are all things that we've outsourced, and we hope by doing that, open source, sorry, we hope that by doing that, the whole industry progresses, not just Facebook. And that's really been our philosophy in the absence of interoperability as it stands.
Yeah, and I think, what Minister Janil said, I think the need for a level of international standards is extremely important because, it's a borderless technology, it's digital technology as it is, and it needs to have that level of sort of minimum standards across the whole world. And the challenge is always there is how to not end up with the lowest common denominator, but to kind of go up and further and get better protection. So for us, so Element AI, we start from fundamental research and go up kind of all the chain of the development up to delivering engineered AI products. And for us, what it means in practice, and kind of how we see the trust development, we think companies that develop AI and that use AI have a very important role, and they have a responsibility to be responsible towards the social impacts, towards the impacts of their technologies. And the more powerful technology, the more the responsibility increases. And so, for example, we look at, there's probably 3 or 4 dimensions. One is transparency, and that's being transparent about the way we develop the technology, publishing the research as much as possible, explaining how things work, and there's an element of increasing the public understanding of technology. That's not always easy to understand for people who are not trained in it. Then there is the explainability itself of the technology. So we know that with deep learning, for example, there are decisions or predictions may not always be very clear how they were made. So investing in that research and in ways for the people using technology to understand why certain decisions or predictions were made. And then talk about transparency, explainability, and then looking for having people in the loop. So kind of looking at AI as something that augments people and that augments their ability to do their work better and faster and more efficiently. But that means that we should not be see AI as replacing people, but as increasing people's agency by giving them more time, by giving them more ability to use their skills in ways they may not have been able to do before. And that means when we have AI systems, it's having people there able to tweak the system, able to see where it may be making decisions that are not optimal and changing that, rather than kind of putting people in the back seat and having the machines at the front. We want it to be the other way around, people first and machines helping them.
Yeah, well, I totally agree, and also, as the minister said, the value and the need for political discussion, it's immense. We actually at the stage today of potential disagreements, but at the same time, we all understand that the need for some global standards and minimal standards on responsible ethical use of artificial intelligence is becoming even more important. If you ask me if there will be a global ethical framework for AI, I don't think so. I mean, it will be at the end of the day a national, maybe regional, and maybe something very granular that makes sense. That makes sense for companies that to really use it and embrace it, and also for public organizations and for the governments there. However, as I said, and I totally agree that interoperability and sort of the political discussion globally needs to start. Don't exclude anyone. It's a global discussion that has to go forward.
Well, what I'll do is I'll try to bring some of these things that we've talked about together into a bit of a proposition as a conclusion and take away from this panel. And then I'll ask you to respond to what I'm putting across, right? So I think there are 3 big points that I'll take away from this. One, I think we are in a search for as much global standards as possible with the right mix of hard regulation, soft regulation, right? But something that's universal, as much consensus and as much harmonization and as much universality as possible across the globe, because it's finding the right balance between hard and soft regulation that we create the second important part that comes out of it, that space, right? How do we, because end of the day, these regulations shape culture. And shaping the culture within an organization is going to be important. We spoke about how individuals, employees play an important role in building that culture. But also, it is important for the culture to be shared, right, between companies as well, that there will be opportunities for them to share what they are learning, and that kind of leads to the third point. How much of what we are doing can be put on these open platforms, both as practices and conducts, both as source codes, right? And both creating that platform for the sharing to take place, that becomes important to build this trust. Now, these are the 3 things I'm taking away from this panel. I'll invite each of you to respond to that or add on to what you are taking away from this panel so that we can all go away with something in our pockets that we can bring home and try to make work. Perhaps I'll start perhaps with that end, Sandhya, and we'll work our way across.
Oh, I get to go first? Great. I think I agree with everything that you talked about. There's just one other additional bit that we'd spoken about, which is just education and awareness, which I think becomes really important. We've built a lot of tools around transparency on our platform, and I think now the effort is also to talk about how we can educate people around that. So in fact, one of the programs that we launched live right here in Singapore is going global. It's called We Think Digital. It's really around digital literacy on Facebook's platform. We want people to know, what they're seeing, why they're seeing what they're seeing, and to be aware of the tools they have. The second bit, and my colleague will talk about it later today, Ariane, and she works very closely with you on the Startup Station, is really around how we're thinking about eliminating bias in AI decision making and how we're thinking about that in terms of a governance framework. And again, there we're closely aligned with your model framework as well. So I think there's both a regulatory aspect to that as well as an education aspect of that we're focused on. That would be my closing thought.
Yeah, maybe the just other thing to add is that one important way also of increasing, getting people to trust AI is to encourage the positive applications of AI for society. So things like drug discovery and assisting with healthcare, like pollution monitoring and helping with a lot of the problems difficulties that we face in every country. And if we encourage that positive use, I think people will start seeing the impact directly on their lives, and I think that will increase trust in technology.
Yeah, for me, I think if I pick up one learning from today is we need to, trusted AI is the way to empower societies. This is really what we have to do. And this is not the job only by a company or a regulator or a civil society organization or a big or small company. It's a combined effort at different levels, both political, global, regional, local, are diverse as it can be and inclusive. So if you have these elements in actually bringing that trustworthiness, I think we are on a very good start.
Thanks for moderating, Zikin. I just one additional point. It's not so much of a takeaway, but I'm going to put it on the table anyway, which is I think we need to have a little bit of faith in ourselves. The idea that we can be faced with a new technology which brings with it opportunities as well as risks and may transform our society. Humanity has been here many times before, whether it's chemical engineering or energy engineering or biomedical engineering or aviation. We have been through this process before, and what do we take away from that? The first is that we don't always get it right the first time. But ultimately, if we are engaged, bring everybody to the table, have these multilateral, multi-stakeholder approaches to improve over time, accept that there needs to be some profit motive, accept that there needs to be some social responsibility, and improve, well, we get there. And I think AI is already here, and we are already on this path, and I think we need to have a little bit of faith in humanity that we can deliver on this.
I see the time is coming. So I think the AI brings the tremendous opportunity, but also the unprecedented challenges. So no one has the right answer yet to the AI development. I think for me, I would rather think we needed to have more interaction among different players and more discussion like this forum. Then we try to figure out the answer. Thank you.
Well, I like the kind of outcome that we've managed to achieve with this panel. It's always nice to start a morning with a positive outcome and outlook. We've taken some lessons, and I think that we've managed to strike a tone which is positive, optimistic about AI, and a bit of and give ourselves a bit of confidence that we know how to handle this. I like the reassurance that we've been here before. This is not the first time that humanity is facing new technology, and if we put our heads together, work together, seek consensus, come together to share, and create the right culture for experimentation and for discovery, I think that's something that we can all build, that kind of ecosystem that we can use to support the creation of a trusted AI ecosystem. Now with that, I'd like to invite the audience to thank the panelists for participating in this, and also to thank you guys for being such a wonderful audience. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We're very honored to have you all.